This is the hour, the Steven hour, and we are back with the 007 movie review. Today we'll be reviewing the 1997 film Tomorrow Never Dies. Now before we do the usual cast and review of the plot, let's get to a little bit of background. Now, like I said, but in the previous one, when I reviewed GoldenEye, in 1995, brought Bond back after a 6-year-long absence. Martin Campbell directed one of the best films in the series, and it also started a new era, not just for the Bond series, for filmmaking, but it also was introduced Bond into a new avenue that, granted, they've been experimenting, but they didn't finally become popular, and that was the GoldenEye video game, which was huge. I left that out in the previous review, and automatically Bond was big and everywhere. Now, Martin Campbell declined, I should say, he didn't refuse, he declined to return for another film, and as a result, they rushed in production to get another film underway. The title of the film was actually meant to be called Tomorrow Never Lies, but due to a typing error, it was Tomorrow Never Dies. Just like with GoldenEye and License to Kill, the film was not so much set or based on any short story. So essentially, from License to Kill and forward, the series had to content with essentially creating new storylines. And also, I want to point out, during this whole era, they also had to essentially find new ways of establishing what this Bond would be. With a pretty modest budget and at least I would say decent budget, I should rather say, we were immediately rushed into production. This film went into production. Also, most things that will be popular around this time is that I want to point out that the Pierce Brosnan era always tried to at least do something different. Whether it was a success or not is really up to the viewer, but they always tried to make sure they did something different every time they went around. With the film being directed by Roger Sportswood, hopefully that is being pronounced right, and if not, I am very sorry. So and as a result, this film did moderately well at the box office, still a big hit, decent hit of course, and of course did well critically. But the question is, how do I feel about the film? Is it a good Bond film, average, or bottom of the barrel? Well, without further ado, let's get into the cast. Of course, things are established with Pierce Brosnan back in the role of James Bond. Now, here this time, he plays a more cool, suave, sophisticated, and essentially everything comments you would expect him by playing a bland Bond people say still stands with this one, but I disagree. And honestly, I really feel in this film he shows a bit more of a darker and more of his acting range in this film and the next film to follow. We have Elliot. Our main villain is Elliot Carver, portrayed by Jonathan Pryce, who is essentially a media mogul, and essentially obsessed with high ratings and essentially controlling the media for his own advantage. I admit that is a pretty cool villain plot, and something that could actually be more relevant for today's climate than it was back in its time when it was released. We also hear, hopefully this is being pronounced right, Michelle Lau as Colonel Wei Lin, essentially a skilled Chinese MSS spy, and essentially is Bond's ally and essentially really the main Bond girl of the film. Here we also have Paris Carver, and is revealed to be a former girlfriend of Bond, and the two have known each other, and is now Elliot Carver's wife. Here we also have Götz Otto as Richard Stamper, Carver's essentially main henchman, like pretty much in pretty much nearly every Bond film. It's getting really lame by this point. And he doesn't really have any of his own characteristics that make him stand out. He's kind of bland. We also here have Dr. Kaufman, portrayed by Vincent Schizfel. I've known this actor for minor roles He played minor characters in TV shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and very minor, and of course the Gangster Squad. I've known him. He's an actor who of course appears in many things, and the short screen time he has in this film is for me really fun to see. We have Charles Robertson, M's essentially portrayed by Colin Salmon. Hopefully that name is being pronounced right. And he's essentially M's deputy chief of staff. For me, there's something about him that just sticks on screen, and I love every minute he's on screen. Here we also have Desmond Llewellyn, still back as Q. We have Samantha Bond back as Moneypenny, Judi Dench as M, all fun to see. We have Jack Wade back, still played by John Doe Baker, and this was either be the last time we will ever get to see him. It's kind of sad because I really liked his character in the previous film, and it's sad that he won't be back. It's a real shame. Here we have Julian Fellowes as the British Minister of Defence. He's a fun character to be there. We also here have Henry Gupta, portrayed by Rick J. And from what I've been told, he's a famous magician with the card tricks. It's really fun to see him. And he's really great. And for me, nearly everything he's in. And lastly, a very minor character is Rear Admiral Rubick, and he's portrayed by Jeffrey Palmer, and he actually has a connection with Judi Dench as they appeared on a famous TV show. I forgot the name, but I find that just a nice little bit of trivia there. And even though he has very small screen presence, not screen presence, he doesn't have small screen presence. Sorry, the short time he has on screen, his presence I really feel is admirably felt, and he has a really good contrast with Judi Dench's M. Anyway, let's get into the review. We open the film up with the usual gun barrel, where we then essentially are in essentially at a terrorist arms deal near the Russian border, where Bond is secretly undercover and is surveilling the whole thing by camera, which is shown back to M and basically majority of MI6 high personnel back at HQ. The Admiral orders one of his frigates to fire a missile. However, they discover that there are 2 nuclear torpedoes mounted on a plane, and essentially if it hits, it will cause radiation to spread everywhere, which then results Bond kicking into action. Something I really love about this film is the action scenes. It's bigger and badder, and honestly, that was kind of nearly how every action film of the decade was kind of like. There was big action films, not just of this decade, but even a bit of the previous one. It's a fun action adventure. Bond manages to get on the plane and essentially gets the, not just missiles out of there, but there's this fun scene where as he's flying, there's a pilot that's knocked out behind him in the cockpit and is strangling him, but he does manages to get out. It's a bit over the top comedic. Pierce Brosnan nails it as always, and essentially that's how we kick off our movie opening with Bond saving the day. It's a nice fun opening, and I like this little scene where Bond punches out a thug for essentially smoking and saying it's a dirty habit, and I find that surprising since Bond always did that in the early years. But that just goes to show that Bond is updating to the present times, and that is something that is, of course, something that's not considered as cool anymore, or with today's social climate. We then of course get to the usual the song of the main song of the movie, with basically David Arnold still on doing composing pieces for essentially the majority of the series, when unfortunately John Barry sadly stepped down and didn't return. The song of the film is of course called Tomorrow Never Dies, and is sung by Sheryl Crow, if I recall correctly. I've got to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of Other than GoldenEye, I've got to be honest, the songs that essentially follow the rest of the Pierce Brosnan era, I don't find to be that entertainable, and I feel like they just get people who have big name powers to actually sing these songs, rather than getting actual people who have proper talent but rely too heavily on actual people with singing skills. I kind of notice, I do tend to notice that a lot. This is not one of my favorite songs of the series, I will be very blunt. After that, we then find out that Elliot Carver is After that, we then find something going off in the North China Sea, where it turns out that there's a group of people essentially trying to who are trying to set up in the British and the Chinese are essentially attacking each other in Navy waters. And this is all being done by two people, Henry Gupta and of course Stamper, who are however, they are not in this alone. They're taking orders from a media mogul, Elliot Carver, and we're finding out that he is essentially trying to set this up for ratings. For ratings and essentially media coverage. And he's using this by using a stealth ship at the dead of night, which is a very interesting. I will admit, I like the design of the ship. A stealth ship does make kind of sense. And essentially, this whole thing results in a death of a fighter pilot, Chinese fighter pilot jet being essentially blown up, which they believe was done by the British, and of course the death of several British sailors. Of course, this is then released in the media, and this is getting on everyone's radar. They're wondering what the hell is going on, and it turns out this news was released way before even the British minister and that all found out. And essentially, Bond is sent to investigate the matter before essentially they're sent in the fleet to start a war. But M believes that Elliot Carver might be responsible, but she didn't tell the government because they know that this would be an because they would have her head if they found out they did. And the only thing that Bond can use to essentially help now is to go to Hungsburg to meet up with Paris Carver, who is revealed to be a former Bond, essentially a person from Bond's past, a former lover. I like the concept that Bond is visiting a former lover. However, what I would have liked if it was Natalia from GoldenEye. According to rumors, the character of Paris was meant to be Natalia, and I would have liked that. Not only would have made some continuity with the previous film, but also would have showed how the relationship didn't work out. And I've got to be honest, Paris' character is one I'm not a huge fan of. Nothing against the actress who plays her in question, but I just feel that she's a very weak character. First off, she's introduced and doesn't have that much time to do on screen, but also it doesn't feel that good of her character how it's written. Anyway, we do get the scene where Bond does go to the airport and runs into Q. Of course, we have to have a Q scene, as we always do. And essentially, he is given his car, and yet another BMW, though it doesn't look like a traditional fancy spy car like we're used to. However, I will admit, unlike in GoldenEye when we didn't get a gadget car scene, this one will, and it pays off in the end. As we find out, can be remote controlled by a phone. The phone is not glamorous, but you gotta understand, this was the 90s. Bond then makes his way to essentially Hungsburg, where he does run into Paris, and it turns out they're on really some bad water there. However, Carver, even though does have a good interaction with Bond, he feels incredibly off and knows that his wife knows him. Despite the fact he tells her that she doesn't, he orders Stamper to take Bond away and essentially interrogate him, which results in a scene where Bond does get beat around a lot and does end up essentially winning. This scene is also cutting into Carver's media presentation. Also during this scene, we also get introduced to Lynn, who is essentially posing as a news reporter, kind of, who just snuck in because he really wanted to meet him. Now I will admit, I like Elliot Carver's character. Even though I feel he's kind of weak on script, I really feel that Price is really breathing life into this role and making it at least remotely enjoyable. He's an enjoyable villain, and I gotta admit, that is something really fun to have. But Bond does humiliate Carver by essentially turning off the news broadcast live, humiliating Carver on national TV. And I admit, part of me loves that. And essentially starts up the rivalry. We also find a bit about Elliot Carver, how he's consults about his image, the love for the media, and also a little bit, and we also see that he does truly love his wife. And in a way, Paris does love him. We then get the scene where Bond is back in his hotel room, and I like the coolness Pierce Brosnan here exuberates, putting the silencer on his gun, waiting for Elliot's men to come, but only Paris comes instead. We get this nice little romance scene, but it does feel rather rushed and poorly dialogued. We then find out that Elliot Carver is doing some background check with the help of Henry Gupta, and finds out that Bond is a bit of a British agent and does know his wife. And then he orders to bring in the Doctor. We don't know who this character is, but thanks to Bond, questioning Paris, he then goes to one of essentially Elliot's hideouts. Essentially is a newspaper printing plant. Essentially, that's its cover, and finds this device that was in the beginning of the film, and quickly takes it, only for Wayland to set off an alarm, and it causes this great action scene which I like. Bond running away, shooting. Pierce Brosnan, for me, I really believe Pierce Brosnan can handle himself with this gun battle, and he makes his escape, gets into his car and drives off, but gets a call from Elliot about his wife to essentially meet her in his hotel room. He then gets there and finds out that Elliot Carver is dead. And while this is happening, there's a news report playing in the background, and it also reveals that another man was found dead too, where Dr. Kaufman also there, and is a professional assassin. Just as that's happening, Carver's men are essentially in the parking garage and are trying to break into the car, but nothing's working. This results in a scene of them having to contact Dr. Kaufman. Hopefully that is his pronouncing right. And essentially, to make Bond help them open the car. Now, I like this scene. Pierce Brosnan is really showing his acting range here and his serious side. He eventually gets the upper hand and kills Kaufman, and really shows a serious professional side. But he also feels slightly remorseful when he sees Paris dead. But he can't do that now. He makes his escape and causes a distraction to get in his car. We get a gadget car chase in the parking lot, but what I like about it is Bond's not in the driver's side. He's in the back driving it by remote control on his phone. It's fun. It's a very unique and innovative, and I like, because we didn't get that much of a gadget car chase in the previous film, they're making it up for this scene, and I absolutely love the enjoyment of it. It ends with Bond making his escape, and essentially once again the car getting damaged. Bond then ends up on essentially a military base, dressed in his Navy uniform. A nice callback to, again, Bond's roots was he was recruited into the British Secret Service because he was in the Navy. Something I like that they've brought that back, and something we've still yet for them to acknowledge, or at least Bond be back in Navy uniform for a while now, where he meets up with Jack Red and finds the coda, and to find out that it was actually covering the Elliot Carver's tracks, with essentially sending the British into unknown waters. They managed to track the location, but find out that what it is that they're in Vietnam. Bond then essentially skydives out of the military plane into the water, and makes his way into the sunken ship where the British Navy people were in the beginning of the film, and sadly where most of those Navy people sadly lost their lives. He finds his way there and finds out that a missile from in the ship has been taken, but runs into Wayland. He manages to get himself and her out on time just before the ship essentially sinks to the bottom of the ocean, where they're then surrounded by Stamper and the rest of their men. They are then taken to essentially Elliot Carver, who is at our headquarters in the local area, where he finds out what he's trying to do is essentially create some kind of distrust, but we don't know fully yet. But you can slowly guess, but I'm not going to reveal it yet. I like the scene where Bond says, "I hope you get the same dedication to Paris," and you can see the little remorse and guilt that he feels here. I'm not sure if that is what he was going for, but that's what I get out of it. Anyway, Bond and Weyland quickly make their escape, and I like it how they not just get out of the building, but they are handcuffed to each other, which is very unique and interesting, and they have to try and make their escape. And what do? Because they can't get the cuffs off in time, they jump on a motorbike, and it's a very inventive chase, and I like it's very creative. However, what I want to point out is I think it goes on a little bit too long. But that's a very minor gripe, and I like how they're taking full advantage of the scenery. However, Bond and Weyland do end up victorious in the chase, but Weyland manages to get the cuffs off and make her escape to essentially one of her hideouts. Bond manages to make her way to the hideout, but here we also get to see Weyland in action as a bunch of Elliot Carver's men turn up, and we get to see her fight all these guys essentially one-on-one while Bond is trying to make his way inside. And when they do, they find out everything makes a whole bunch of sense. It turns out that Elliot Carver's made some deal with some General Chang, and they don't know what they're up to, but they realize that they managed to find out about the stealth bow. We get to a lot of fun, and because we aren't in, however, because we're not in Q's traditional lab, we do get to see all the gadgets that Weyland wields, and Bond essentially gets an update. Gone is the Walther PPK, and gets an updated version of the Walther, which you can actually see in this promo. And Pierce Brosnan will essentially use that not for the rest of his run, but Daniel Craig would use that in his very first film of his tenure. Anyway, the two agreed to team up and essentially storm Elliot Carver's stealth boat. Now, something I want to point out, it's clear they're trying to force romance between these two characters, but I never bought that, and I find it very forced. Anyway, they make their way to the stealth boat, but however, they are caught, but Bond manages to fake his death, and Weyland is taken capture. But I do like she's not taken capture without a fight. Again, something I like about her, she takes no prisoner. And trust me, you're going to enjoy far more as we go on with essentially what's left of the film. We find out Elliot Carver is essentially trying to start a world war between Britain and the Chinese, with General Chang having some help in the matter. And essentially, as he wants to start a war, what Elliot Carver gets out of this is ratings and news. And I like the idea of the media setting up a war for ratings and that. It's something that can be done really well with modern times. However, Bond does manage to cause a distraction by setting up bomb explosives, and we also find out that the missile that was stolen is going to be used to be fired at the Chinese, essentially starting the war. And it's also done around, and because they're on a stealth boat, they need to make sure they're around a local British sailor ship in order for that to work. So that way they can really blame it on the British. However, Bond does manage to get Weyland out of her captive situation and cause a massive explosion on the ship. Just as that's happening, he's also sent word back to M about the events, and she's also sent word to the British naval ship, and they sent word to the Chinese, essentially informing of the whole thing. And essentially, because of the explosion on the ship, they're now exposed to the British naval ship. However, they have no choice but to make their escape. Elliot Carver orders his men to quickly find Weyland and Bond and kill them all immediately. And sadly, Gupta is already dead. Just as that's happening, Weyland makes her way to the engine room and essentially destroys the engine, stopping the ship from mobile. I love the action scene that's going on through this, but I can see it's heavily over the top. Even though it's fun action, I see it's a bit over the top and a bit too bland. Bond, however, does manage to get to the control station and trying to prevent the countdown, only to be held at gunpoint by Elliot Carver, who wants to shoot Bond. But Bond uses a trick and essentially kills Carver by using this giant drill machine that was used to essentially cause the ship to sink at the very beginning of the film. I kind of find it a little bit poetic, though I would have preferred something different, and I'll explain that later after the plot review synopsis. However, there's still one person left, Stamper the henchman. However, Stamper's got his hands on Weyland, but Bond manages to essentially free her in a fight with Stamper. And it's another generic Bond going up a very strong, imposing, and indestructible blonde hair German or Russian henchman. You know, we get this so much. But Bond does manage to cause the missile to explode in the ship just as he manages to make his escape, causing Stamper to die and the ship to sink. Bond manages to save Weyland just in time, frees her, and of course they have their usual moment, and that's where we end the film. Tomorrow Never Dies is definitely a fun action film, but it's definitely a generic Bond film. I think Pierce Brosnan's acting range is incredibly increased. Weyland is a very different and unique Bond girl. I like Elliot Carver as a very different Bond villain, and he's certainly a villain that's certainly grown on me to really like, and that's probably goes to Jonathan Pryce's performance. However, I want to point out something going forward. I find the plot to be different, and I do find the idea of Bond running into a past flame is interesting. But I feel they don't go all the way with that idea. I would have liked if Natalia could have returned, and it would have been a far more interesting and compelling Bond girl, because as a Bond girl we've got to know and love. It would have been nice if they did that. Also, something I also feel, it's very generic Bond action film. I liked how the action is getting bigger and better, but I really wish the story could have been more focused and more streamlined to be different and unique. I really wish the title could have been Tomorrow Never Lies instead of Tomorrow Never Dies, because it would have made more sense with the film. Also, another thing is Elliot Carver's death. Even though I don't find it to be a bad death, I would have liked if it could have been, instead of died, he should have been exposed for what he was doing. His reputation and media empire going down the drain. For me, I felt that would have been a far more interesting thing for his character, rather than him being essentially another maniacal, crazy person just trying to do this for ratings. I will not deny that Tomorrow Never Dies is not the worst Pierce Brosnan film, but I wouldn't consider it one of his best, if that's a thing. It's definitely, for me, Tomorrow Never Dies is a generic fun film. You can enjoy it whenever it's on, but it's something you're not going to be rushing to see. It's not, and I also feel it was and I don't know, I don't really know why they went with the direction they did, but I can't deny it wasn't a fun film. It's definitely not groundbreaking. It introduces some ideas. I wish it could have gone with it, but for me, when I rank Pierce Brosnan's personal films, I kind of view this as his third best, believe it or not, and I'll explain why when we review his other film, which will be coming up later in the series. And there we have it, Tomorrow Never Dies. A generic Bond film, sure, but a fun one, and there's nothing wrong with having that. Anyway, after this, the film did pretty well at the box office. It was kind of, and pretty much for majority of Pierce Brosnan's film going forward, it was mixed. But however, it was still a success nonetheless. However, after this, and realizing the big action scenes, what the series decided to do, they wanted to try and do a more character-driven Bond film. So what they decided to do was, for their next one, would be 1999's The World Is Not Enough. And if that title sounds familiar, it should. Because that was the Bond's family motto, the world is not enough. So stick around when we review that one next up in the 007 lineup. So until then, this has been The Hour, the Steven Hour. Ladies and gentlemen, so long for now.